Hello and welcome back to Blood, Guts, and Social Commentary, and part 2 of our look at horror movies for people that don't like horror. Let's jump right into 1974 with Bad Ronald, a perverted teenage boy who lives in the walls of a house finds the house sold to a family after his mother dies, and he falls for one of the new residents. This was a made-for-TV movie, and it actually has like zero blood. And when I say zero blood, I mean he kills somebody and there's zero blood. So this one relies almost completely on atmosphere and storytelling as a means for horror, and nothing really gratuitous. There's the creep and note factor of somebody's living in your house that you don't know is living there, but that's what horror's for, so. 1975 with Jaws. A great white shark arrives on the shores of a New England beach resort and wreaks havoc with bloody attacks on swimmers until a part-time sheriff teams up with a marine biologist and an old surfer to hunt the monster down. This one, the term bloody in the synopsis is subjective. There is blood, but it's typically in the water. Some people can have a mental disconnect with that of it's not coming straight out of the body, so it doesn't bother them as much. Also, with most liquids, when you put it in water, it spreads very quickly and it dissipates, and it just doesn't look as realistic. The shark attacks, they are somewhat bloody, but they don't show the shark all that much. So the benefit of that is it cuts away very quickly, so you don't see a whole lot of blood, guts, and gore. The goriest thing probably in this is the chum, which is like the little fish parts they put into the water to attract sharks. At this point, Jaws is probably like Psycho, and you've probably seen the bloodiest parts of it just living in America. So if you can handle what you've already seen of it, you can probably just see the movie. 1976, The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane. 13-year-old Ryan Jacobs lives alone in a high-class Quebec small town. But unknown to the neighbors, she is leading a secret and dangerous life. This one, there's a small amount of blood from a head injury because she pushes someone down the stairs. There is a pet dying. It's a gerbil, I believe. And there is the landlord's adult son making advances towards Ryan, who is like 13, 14, which is you. Because this movie mostly rests on where in the world are Ryan's parents, because they're just not there. She does talk heavily about poisoning people, and somebody is poisoned on screen, but it's again not overly graphic. It's just, you know from what's being said that they're being poisoned, and it's kind of a grasping at throat fall over type of thing. It's not a spitting up blood and aspirin tablets type of murder. So the blood is pretty minimal on this. The only really objectionable things would be the pet death and the whole idea of absentee parenting and somebody creeping on a newly teenaged girl. 1980, John Carpenter's The Fog. Legend says Antonio Bay was built in 1880 with blood money obtained from shipwrecked lepers, which no one believes. On the eve of the town centennial, many plan to attend the celebrations, including the murdered lepers. This one obviously has ghosts in it because that's implied from the synopsis. Even for lepers, they're not horribly graphic because leprosy, most people equate that to like limbs falling off and stuff like that. So these people have like kind of a rotted appearance, but they're not horrified gaping holes everywhere, appendages just falling off willy-nilly. So it's not horrifying in that aspect. There also is a remake of this one that's pretty low on graphic violence, but this one's probably the least objectionable of the two. And I'm sure the guys at the UHM podcast would be happy to weigh in on the remake for me. 1982, Poltergeist. A family's home is haunted by a host of ghosts. That is a lot of alliteration. This one stays pretty on the tame side as well, especially considering it's from the 80s and was in that big slasher boom, even though this is not a slasher. There is a dead pet, but that It's a bird. It died of natural causes completely. Yeah, you just see it laying in the cage, and the mother comes in. It's just like, couldn't you have died during the week? And it's basically just lamenting that they can't hide the death from their daughter. The only other big part is there is a scene where the father, it looks like he's peeling off his face. He really isn't. It's kind of a hallucination, dream type thing. He's fine. And it's even done in kind of a cartoony way that doesn't feel very real. In 1983, something wicked this way come. In a small American town, a diabolical circus and its demonic proprietor prey on the townsfolk. This is based off the work of Ray Bradbury, but this one's rated PG and is actually marketed as a family film. I worked a few family films in here, not as a kind of slap in the face of, well, you can't handle horror film, so here's a family film, you wussy. Just as kind of a, hey, if you're looking at this list for possibly a child or somebody in the younger audience, here are a few options. Plus, there are plenty of adults that enjoy a good family film from time to time. Doesn't mean you need to have kids. The only really objectionable things I've saw in this seemed like innocuous injuries. There's a point where the guy's holding his fist so tight he actually starts to bleed a little bit, like he's digging his nails in. There's a point where the father gets cut on his palm. So when it's wrapped up, there's blood on the bandage from where the cut was. And they do talk heavily about loss of parent. So if that's kind of a no-go for you, then I would suggest avoiding this movie. But most of the injuries are very minor, and I don't feel like they're anything you wouldn't see somewhere else in another genre. 1983, Twilight Zone the movie. 4 horror/sci-fi segments directed by 4 famous directors, each of them being a new version of a classic story from Rod Serling's landmark television series, The Twilight Zone. Again, The Twilight Zone is so embedded into our culture at this point, I think it'd be hard to meet somebody who's never seen anything from it, and these pulled for some really classic episodes, like the gremlin on the wing of the plane, the kid that could send people away with his mind. The only really objectionable things I saw that could be a problem for some people is in the first story, it dealt with a guy who's incredibly racist and uses a lot of slurs. Obviously, he gets his because Twilight Zone. And in that story, there is a Klansman who's set on fire. So yes, you have a human being set on fire, which is a bad thing, but the person set on fire is a Klansman, so I could see people objecting to that one a little less than just a random person on the street set on fire. But those are the 2 things I could see definitely people being frightened by. There's a few morphs, but you don't see anything like grisly. It's just somebody turns away and turns back around and all of a sudden they're poof a demon. It's not like those Wolfman films in the 80s where we got those really like bone crunching, skin tearing, painful transformations. These were very quick. They seemed like if there was either no pain or very little pain because you didn't hear any cry of distress. 1984, Gremlins. A boy inadvertently breaks 3 important rules concerning his new pet and unleashes a horde of malevolent, mischievous monsters on a small town. Dear God, this list has a lot of alliteration. Again, this one is PG as well, but I do want to note for those that saw my episode on the MPAA, I'll link it here. This was one of the movies that actually led to a creation of the PG-13 system, because this one they felt was not graphic enough for an R, but thought it might be a little too intense for everybody that the PG covered. So this and Jaws is why Spielberg himself actually pushed for the creation of, he wanted a PG-14, but it ended up being PG-13. Because there are some people that this just might have been a little too intense for. The only major objectionable things is there is a guy that's, again, being racist, just like the last film we saw, because he lost his job. Their family dog is caught up in lights at one point and left out in the porch in the cold. He is totally fine, though. They get him out of the lights. They comment. He's like, you would have been a popsicle in, a couple more minutes. The dog is fine, though. When the gremlins happen, they start killing them. And one of them is microwaved, another one gets melted down. So if you have a problem with animal-like creatures, being killed. This is probably something to avoid. And there's an old woman that gets thrown out of a window. But again, you don't really see anything. It's not super graphic. She's on a chairlift. They speed it up and she goes flying out of a window onto a snowbank. That's all you really see of it. Since this was a movie intended for younger audiences, the violence tends to be approached in a more comedic way. 1985, Return of the Living Dead. When two bumbling employees at a medical supply warehouse accidentally release a deadly gas into the air, the vapors cause the dead to rise again as zombies. That certainly is a hell of an error. This is also probably one of the most violent movies that's entered onto this list. The reason for that is some people don't count mummies and zombies as being human. They count them as, they don't have an issue with like humanoid beings being killed. So if you don't see a distinction, just skip this one. Definitely not for you, because there's a decent amount of nudity in this one, because there's a girl that just loves to go into cemeteries and get naked. That is her thing. That's what she likes to do. She is naked 90% of this movie. If nudity is a thing with you, just pitch this one out right now. Since this entire movie takes place at a company that sells bodies that have been donated to science to medical schools, because that is a thing, there is a puppy that's been split in half that's being sold to veterinary school that comes to life, jumping around. To be fair, the puppy seems incredibly happy. He doesn't seem to be in pain, but it's a split in half puppy. There is a flesh melt on one of the corpses. There's cut in half mummy thing kind of walking around, and just there's a whole bunch of zombies running around with varying states of dismemberment because they were being sold off to science. But if you have an aversion to violence and anything human-like dying, then yeah, skip this one. 1985, Fright Night. When a teenager learns that his next-door neighbor is a vampire, no one will believe him. Yeah, why would they? There's a guy that gets stabbed in the hand in this movie. There is somebody that holds a cross up to a vampire, and it kind of burns a cross into their forehead, but it's kind of really cartoony, so I'm not dogging on the movie for bad effects or anything like this. It just, that effect did not hold up. There is a sex scene that some people were bitten. The bites were consensual, but there's some blood coming out of them. There is a body morph. One of the vampires gets stabbed. They start morphing into almost this werewolf type thing, but it's kind of unrealistic. As well as there's a scene where one of the girls' mouths morphs into this really elongated, very unrealistic thing, which again, the fact that it's so unrealistic kind of makes it not so bad. For some people, it makes it less scary. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that these things didn't hold up, because it does take that edge off of it for some people of, oh, I can handle this because the human body just can't do that. It just looks weird. 1986, In a Glass Cage. A Nazi doctor who has a fetish for young boys feels guilt after torturing and murdering his latest victim and throws himself off a roof. Some years later, the doctor, confined to an iron lung, accepts as his nurse a boy who secretly witnessed the killing. Now, I'm going to preface this one by saying, even though there is very little blood and gore in this one, there is one scene in the beginning where the boy has a bloody back, and there's another scene where somebody gets their throat slit. Both are very quick with showing the blood. They don't linger on it, and there's very small amounts of blood, especially considering what is happening. That does not make this movie an easier watch. Not only does this deal with the atrocities that happened during World War II, it deals with the subject of pedophilia. As the summary mentions, there's a boy that secretly witnessed the killing. He kind of comes in and starts to play nurse. The wife of the man in the iron lung calls him out, and he insists on keeping the boy as his nurse. It becomes this weird penance for what this man did, and there is a sense of guilt, and there is this torture element of this kid wants to see this man suffer for what he did, which is a totally valid emotion, considering what he watched him do and what he probably went through during World War II. Like I said, this is not an easy watch. It's a great film. It's worth seeing. It's just not something that you're gonna pull out and casually watch a million times over. I've owned this film for I can't tell you how many years, and I've probably only watched it twice. It's just not something you're gonna pull out on the regular. But it's important, and it does talk about very important topics. It's just not something you should go into in the wrong headspace. On to something oddly lighter, 1986 Manhunter. A former FBI profiler, Will Graham, returns to service to pursue a deranged serial murderer named the Tooth Fairy by the media. If this sounds oddly familiar, it should. This is based off the novel Red Dragon, which is the same novel Silence of the Lambs was based off of. There is a bit of blood in this, and someone is set on fire, but neither are overly graphic. 1987, The Gate. Two young boys accidentally release a horde of nasty, pint-sized demons from a hole in a suburban backyard. What follows is a classic battle between good and evil as two kids struggle to overcome a nightmarish hell that literally begins to take over the earth. This one, the objectionable scenes are a family pet does die. They reference that the dog was incredibly old though, so it may have been natural causes. They're not really sure though. There is a point where there's a dream sequence where faces kind of cave in and fall off, but again, it's very cartoonish and weirdly over-exaggerated and doesn't look realistic at all, and that was clearly by design. And there's a point where a hand gets cut off. But again, totally cartoonish, not realistic at all. A lot of horror fans reference this, a lot of horror fans, at least in my age group, reference this as their first horror movie and what got them into the genre. So take that for what you will. Part of me wants to say it's like, we turned out fine, but that's debatable in some cases. Because it's between this and Maximum Overdrive for my first horror movie. So there's some nostalgic love for this, but it is for the most part acceptable for younger viewers, but at least if you're coming at it from an adult perspective, you definitely should be fine. 1987, The Monster Squad. A young group of monster fanatics attempt to save their hometown from Count Dracula and his monsters. This is a family film. Again, like I said, I'm peppering a few of them in here. There's a little blood through the film, but it's all incredibly cartoonish. This was geared towards children, and it's really meant to all be in good fun. 1987, The Lost Boys. After moving to a new town, two brothers discover that the area is a haven for vampires. There's a dog attack where a hand gets bitten, and there's a little bit of blood there, and then there's an electrocution via water. And a couple of these, but I'm going to specifically point out this one to rule out a bias because, as I'm sure most of you have figured out, I have been a hardcore horror fan for a decade or so now. This was my first time viewing this though, so I have no nostalgic attachment to this. I'm not going, oh, I watched this as a kid, so it's totally fine. This is the first time I watched this, totally new eyes on it. And that's all I saw that was objectionable, that I could see somebody having an issue with it. I really did try and look at this from a point of view of somebody who has a lot of issues seeing any kind of violence or bodily harm or grievous harm to anything or anyone. Specifically, I have a few people in my head, but I'm not going to call out who because I don't want them to think I'm being mean to them. Everybody has their own standards and everybody has their own comfort levels. So I just try to put myself in their position of, okay, would so-and-so have a problem with this? And if the answer was yes, I put it down. That concludes part 2 of our look at horror movies for people that don't like horror. Please join us next week for part 3. If you like what you're hearing, please hit like, comment, subscribe. If you don't like what you're hearing, please throw out suggestions. Let me know. Again, I'd like to give special thanks to David Austin and from UHM or UpcomingHorrorMovies.com, Necromancer, Street Fighter, Solo, Cool Mike, Astronomus, and Little Ghost. I again really apologize if I'm screwing up your guys' usernames. You guys really did help me out by throwing out suggestions. I really couldn't have gotten through this series without you guys. It's very much appreciated. And thank you to everybody for listening.